Welcome to Spin Nation, where the podcast that helps you slice the noise by looking at the data. We break down the different narratives that are trying to shift your perception on the issues that matter most to Canadians. I'm your host, Laurel, and welcome as always to my co-host, Emmanuel.
Good morning, Laurel.
So today's topic, we are going to be looking at the issue of housing. This, of course, was a big topic of conversation over the election. It continues to be top of mind for Canadians. We wanted to see, where do Canadians place the blame for a housing crisis? So we have introduced the data point of the week, or le chiffre de la semaine. And this week it is that immigration is cited in over 30% of the online discussion about housing in Canada. So very tight correlation between two really critical narratives happening across the country. Emmanuel, we looked at four key narratives that we're poking through. What are they?
So, we're looking at breaking down the housing conversation, one of the favorite subjects of Canadian. And we broke it down into immigration, seniors, developers, and the development process, and finally, cost of living. That gives us a good slice of what are these key topics. And I want to introduce this chart here, which looks at the overall volume of conversation. And this is across both media and social media for the period of the last year or so.
Okay, I've got that up. So it looks like, housing was a really hot topic during the election. For those who are listening, there's this huge peak that happens around April. I looked into that. That was tied very closely to the different political parties making their campaign promises about how they were going to build more housing faster, cheaper, and more affordable. But it seems to have been trending down since then.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. So what we have is a trend line of, say, between 10 and 15,000 mentions per week here, pretty much continuous from August of last year all the way to the beginning of June this year. And when we look at the subtopics that we talked about, cost of living, immigration, developers, seniors, all of that was a pretty lively debate before June, but it's really recessed during the summer holidays, and it's, I would say, probably at 1/3 of the volume. So a very significant downshift in this conversation, which is really impressive because housing was probably maybe not the top topic of the election conversation, but certainly a very important part of the conversation. Both parties introduced housing plans as part of their party platforms, and it was something that was discussed in multiple different ways at debates and throughout the campaign. So it's very interesting that it suddenly drops out of sight, like it like this data shows.
Now, this obviously it's been on on everyone's radar, but what struck me and what changed in the last month, even though it has, you just said it's trended down, but seniors were starting to become a focal point of the discussion, and you can see that bump down around towards the end of July. And I found it was really playing into these generational wars that we often see all the time. That used to be millennials, and then it's the Gen Zs and the alphas. But this was focused on how many retirees and boomers were staying in their homes longer. And this in turn was making it harder for the next generation to get a foot into the market. So it was placing the blame at the foot of the retirees and the boomers and some of the older Gen X. And then because when they were talking about, we're going to build more and bring the cost of getting into a home down, on the opposite side of that coin are so many Canadians who have a lot of their retirement income built into the equity of their home. So you may remember early on in the Carney government's mandate, they had just formed government, and I think it was Minister Guilbeault who had taken over this portfolio, and he said something around maintaining the equity in the home, or people were sort of asking him that question. I can't remember off the top of my head what his answer was. I'd have to go and look it up. But people were saying, oh no, now they're going to come for the equity in your home. What's evolved from that now is, why should we continue to keep housing values up? And why should the next generation be essentially funding the retirement of the boomers and the Gen X? And that we should bring the value of all these homes down. But of course, if you are a homeowner, you don't want to see the value of your house come down because you're counting on having that potentially liquidating that equity at some point to fund your retirement. This generational battle has started to play out over the summer.
Yes, this has always been sort of the problem of this policy that we've had in Canada to encourage home ownership is, for 30 years, we've been driving the prices of homes higher and higher, which is great for the owners, but perhaps not as great for those that are not part of home ownership.
Let's jump to the immigration element of this discussion. It's consistently there. I would say immigration overall, there's a lot of tension evolving in Canada related to immigration, whether or not we have the right balance. I think people have come to the conclusion that we over indexed on bringing new people in. We did not have the housing and the healthcare and the infrastructure to support that. But it seems like there's fuel being thrown on the fire coming from a number of different angles. And the way that this data is being shared.
That's right. And it's interesting that we see this immigration conversation peak around the time of the election. So it shows that it's an important topic and that those two things overlap significantly. Um, Laurel, I think you pointed out to me an article from the National Post from a few weeks ago that made briefly some waves in the social ecosystem.
Yeah, it's interesting. They seem to have pulled that article off. It's no longer online, but it was. But it actually came from some data the government released. StatsCan, in collaboration with IRCC, looking specifically answering this question: how much does immigration increase the cost of housing? And they came out, this report was released in June 2025, but it only really got picked up, let's say, towards the end of July. And this key number that the government highlighted in the executive summary was that, for those arriving within 5 years, it accounted for approximately 11% of the increase in the costs of housing. And they looked at purchasing a home, but they also looked at renting. And that, of course, that 11% was the headline that the Financial Post ran with, but has now been deleted.
So that was the headline number, 11%. That sounds like a lot at first glance. But I looked a little deeper into this research. So what's really interesting about this piece is this is not your usual policy white paper that kind of looks at, taking in some data and deciding how we should think through our policy. This was more of a research paper with the usual written abstract and then the methodology that was used and the different scenarios that they examined. And out of all of this comes this number of 11%. And I should point out a really interesting point to me was that if immigration had 11% of the impact on increasing the cost of housing in Canada, that means 89% of the increase is actually due to other causes. So, really, immigration in this particular study did not show a significant impact on housing. It was actually more other factors. Now, I'll be quick to point out the other thing about this report is the data that they examined was over 3 different 5-year periods, but the last period ended in 2021. So that did not at all take into consideration the last few years where we've had higher than average immigration. And yet this piece of data becomes the focal point of media and online and social media conversation without being fully understood or even digested by the different influencers trying to drive the narrative towards their own perception.
There was another piece of government data that came out that was even bigger than this one you were just talking about, Emmanuel. This was a report published on the government on its website back in March, but this was the $1.1 billion number being paid by the government to house asylum seekers in hotels. That became a media story only on July 23rd by the Globe and Mail. I know Jenny Kwan from NDP was involved in that as well in some capacity. It was a 1 day story, 1 or 2 day story, but it really picked up legs. All the major outlets picked it up. It went wild on social media and got amplified a lot. Again, because this big number, 1.1 billion, it catches a lot of eyes. And I think the government needs to be a little bit more thoughtful, especially when it comes to these issues around immigration and housing are two prime examples about how they're framing data. I think that in the interest of transparency, and I think this data was actually on a transparent a webpage called Transparency on the government website, is that if you just put the data out there, it then can be picked up and manipulated in different ways. And I think that's what happened here with this 1.1 billion number that was used. Again, in government, I think even when I used to work in it, you wanted to put big numbers. Look how much we're investing, big numbers. But in this case, the big number was not, I think, delivering the message that they wanted to.
And that's always a challenge. How do you release these white papers or this research papers, but then put it into a context of transparency and making sure that you're not fudging the numbers? We're hearing a lot of stories in the last couple of weeks where President Trump was not happy with some job numbers and just decided to fire the statisticians that were in charge of that project. And I don't want us to get into the same situation where government has full control of what's being published or not published after it's been commissioned.
That's definitely true. And this is the double-edged sword with transparency is without it, people create narratives about what's going on. But then when you are transparent, it can create narratives based on what you're releasing. So I think the government just has to be quite thoughtful. It's not about spinning it, but making sure in the language and the way that it's presented, there's real clarity on what these numbers mean and why they're being released and what was the goal of those dollars. Then 1.1 billion was used as a counterpoint to say how much we're investing in asylum seekers to give them a roof over their head, but we have people who live here who are living on the streets. We have seniors who have nowhere to go. We have homeless. So it becomes then an us versus them, and it feeds into that story that they should be mindful of when they release data.
Right. And I would argue that the best way to do this is to have a really coherent plan and how we're supportive and how we provide the right tools for those asylum seekers so that they're just not left on the street once they step into country. But I'm not sure yet that we're seeing that sort of narrative come out of the government. And that's one of the things that I want to bring us back to housing plans that were discussed during the election. There's been grumblings that some sort of plan is coming our way, but we've yet to see any articulation, I think, of what that might look like.
They're going to start a new agency, aren't they? Like a new agents house home, building Canada. A new government agency was, but the details.
That's not the plan.
Yeah,
that's
just
here. We're going to do something and kick
yes.
the can down the road. I'm fine with the concept, but now it's time to show us, okay, what does that mean? What's the impact? How do we pay for this? And how does it fit within the broader objective of Canada, who's juggling a number of different challenges, like increasing the size of the army and at the same time fighting off the trade war and so many other hot potatoes. Right now, we're not seeing a ton come out of Ottawa in terms of narrative, and it's going to be time to put all of these pieces together in some sort of holistic view of what the next 2-3 years are going to be about. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I imagine they're still formulating what it means and how to implement it. And this is where, it's easy to make an announcement.
It's easy to make an announcement.
It's easy to say. I mean, it's what are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
I want to talk a bit about the developer narrative. I was because so this is my expectation that the perception of part of our housing crisis is due to developers who are building very small little rental small, 5 or 600 square foot condos and saturating the market so they can maximize profits and that they aren't meeting the actual demand because it doesn't economically make as much sense. So I expected there to be a strong, greedy, profit-driven developer narrative in here, and I did not see it.
We live in Ontario, and developers were definitely top of mind a few years ago when there was a big greenbelt scandal, and they were being cast as the villain in a lot of the narrative. So it is a little bit surprising not to see them being cast as the villain in this cost of living emergency here. My sneaking suspicion is it's not easy to be a developer right now. So because of the change in the interest rates over the last couple of years, we're hearing a lot about different projects being delayed or taking longer or being dropped altogether. And I'm wondering if that's seeping through that sort of narrative that developers are in a bit of a rough spot right now. And that might be why it's not coming up as much as we might have expected.
It could be I saw the strongest keyword association with the developers was around building affordable housing. So I think that they are repositioned and have successfully, whether intentionally or not, repositioning themselves as the solution to build this affordable housing. Now, how they make the economics make sense, obviously would have to be government participation or subsidies in some way, shape, or form, cutting fees, who's to say? It was more around how they're going to do the building.
So I want to put out a couple of data points. First, I'll do a little plug for one of the most watched economics show in our podcasts or Canadian podcasts. The name is The Looney Hour, and it's a show that it combines Steve Stareski. I believe he's in the real estate market, but also two macroeconomists. And they talk about these things, particularly the real estate in Canada. But one of the points that they raised in last week's show is that we're seeing a shift in the type of building that is being constructed. And we're going back to the 1970s with these changes, where developers are actually starting many more projects that are rental projects, as opposed to the past where a lot of the developments were, condos or dwellings that were going to be owned by individuals. Another interesting podcast, the Public Policy Forum, interviewed the president of Mattamy Homes, and he was explaining on the show how Mattamy is trying to simplify some of the construction logistics with modular housing and a number of other things that they were putting in place to help facilitate the growth of housing stock in Canada.
Again, positioning themselves as part of solutions. So they've had some great PR in that respect if they've managed to shift the conversation. I want to pick up on something you said around moving to rentals, as that's what the market is more ripe for right now. But I will say that that does, I think, on the final narrative we looked at, which is cost of living, which I would describe as a catch-all. So inflation and grocery prices and gas prices and cost of housing was wrapped up in this overall cost of living nutshell or bag of things. It just encapsulates the overall frustrations Canadians have with having less in their pockets than they used to at the end of the day. But it was really fueled by the election where these pocketbook issues were being leveraged by different political parties to help secure votes and they can make promises. But to your talk about rental, it doesn't help those who still seek the Canadian dream of home ownership. And that's a very fundamental part, I think, to being North American. It's the same in the US, it's the same here. This idea of home ownership being something that you strive to have. Well, I think the rental is going to fill a specific need and demand that there is, whether or not it's going to help, or it could still leave some of the pressure for those who seek to have their own home. And I can tell you, we're going to move on in a second to a regional breakdown of these conversations by the different provinces. In Ontario, the conversation is very heavy on rent control and the removal of rent control by the Ford government, but I can imagine it would be different in other parts of Canada.
That's very interesting to see that reflected there. Yes.
Well, shall we move on and look at what the breaking it down by province?
Let's look at this provincial breakdown. So here we have a bar chart, and this is over the last 6 months of data. And what is notable here is we're looking at the share of voice of these different topics. And immigration is one of the key topics, in particular in Alberta and Quebec, with the highest percentage, 41 and 43%. And that is actually reversed in Ontario and BC. Those are probably the largest provinces that, in terms of taking in immigrants. And there, the concern is actually cost of living at 42 and 49%. So we're seeing an interesting contrast here. The province that takes in the most immigrants is less concerned or least concerned about that versus cost of living. Any thoughts why that could be?
Could it be because BC and Ontario were leaders in accepting new immigrants? So a little bit more accustomed to it, a little more comfortable versus Alberta. What now as they no, I think Montreal though, there's been a lot of immigration into Montreal, but maybe in the broader Quebec province of Quebec, you might have a point of view on this. Having such a large influx of new people is still on the new side, so they're more aware of it. That would be potentially my guess.
I'd agree with that. The difference in Quebec is the immigration question. It's an always on conversation, and that's because of the language issue. So there's always been an ongoing debate about taking in immigrants, making sure that they're integrated within the culture and in particular the language. And that just keeps coming up year after year after year to make sure that I guess Quebec has a certain degree of control in terms of what's happening there. And I think that's unique within the Confederation in terms of having that special control for French.
Did you see there was some protest? Because I think to pass CEGEP, you need to pass a French language exam, and there were some immigrants, students who came, and they had no French language proficiency, and so they were trying to start a movement to exclude themselves from having to pass this French, saying it was unfair that they would have to pass French to graduate. I can imagine it was a very controversial perspective.
I did not catch that.
Yeah, go check it out. They were fully starting a campaign to try to get an exclusion from having to write their French proficiency.
Have to look that up, and in particular, the reception in the rest of Quebec to such a suggestion. I would say that my experience has been that people would react pretty strongly to something like that.
I mean, I react pretty strongly to that. I moved to Quebec when I was 19, and I moved there knowing that it is a French-speaking province. Now, I was in Montreal. It's very bilingual, obviously. But that the onus was on me as the person moving there to learn some French. Just like when we moved to China, the onus was on us to learn Mandarin and speak some Mandarin. I don't agree with these students because they would have known before coming that this would have been an ultimate requirement that they'd have to complete. And if you had no interest and no intention of learning the French, then don't go to Quebec. You go somewhere else.
That's certainly historically what the position has.
All right. So anything else here across the provinces that struck you? Obviously, cost of living, you talked about seniors. I thought the fact that the seniors quite a lot in the prairies and Alberta. I tried to dig into this a bit. It was a mixed bag between we should have affordable housing for seniors and also what I mentioned earlier around why should we be funding boomers' retirement by allowing them to maintain high value in their homes.
Yes, so it's interesting to note, that senior conversation is highest in Atlantic Canada, and the prairies, excluding Alberta, and finally BC. I would hazard a guess, sort of matches my understanding of the demographics, perhaps, where there might be more retirees in those provinces.
Okay, so shall we move on to our so what?
Well, so what? I think number one, we have a summer recess here, and it's definitely impacted the conversation. I think my guess here is everybody's giving the Carney government some time to come up with these new housing plans. But I think that the patience of Canadians will end pretty much on the Tuesday after Labor Day weekend when everybody's back at work, back at school, and starting to expect movement. I would suggest that the government needs to be ready with a strong narrative to put all of these bits and pieces in place very quickly once summer's over.
For me, I think there is two things that are important for us to understand. This connection between immigration and housing, yes, it's a supply and demand is a reality. People, when they come here, are going to want to go to the locations in the cities that have economic opportunity. And then, of course, that creates more demand for places to live. That can raise rents as well. But I do think that there is a fine line between acknowledging that we have to have the right balance of supply and demand with the outright xenophobia that we're seeing in social media channels, where every issue is blamed at the feet of people who have moved here. I think especially people who move here legally and follow the processes and the procedures, then they are part of our communities, and we have to think through how do we ensure that they have safe, affordable housing for themselves as well for local residents. I do understand when people see those headlines about paying for asylum seekers in hotels when there's people local who are sleeping on the streets. I understand that frustration and where it's coming from. And I also think there's a very big difference between those who are economic immigrants, people who come here for, they have a fine life where they are, but they come here for more opportunity versus those who are asylum seekers, which is what we were talking about, people who had to pick up and run. And I think we need to be a little bit more understanding about the difficulties that these people face because they probably do not have the financial means to support themselves because they were fleeing persecution, war, death, and destruction. And I think as Canadians, we should be a bit more supportive of people like that. So the government, though, when they put data out, has to keep all of this context in mind. That doesn't mean fudge the data. It means just making sure you're having the right context setting when you put data out. And I don't think they did that in these cases.
I would agree, making sure that the supporting data is communicated, effectively communicated, and communicated where the audiences are. And I would argue that the strongest area or channels where detractors reside is primarily Twitter. And often a lot of, or a significant portion of those that are being informed by Twitter are on purpose avoiding incumbent media like the CBC, Globe and Mail, and some of the other large media networks that we have. So their only source of information is through Twitter. And so if the communication campaigns are exclusively through the usual means, then it will never reach the largest audience of detractors on immigration. And that could turn into a problem.
Mm. Yeah, we have to be careful of this us versus them mentality that can
That's
be
right.
is very pervasive right now.
You can never stop communicating to your opponents. Otherwise, that you're just leaving the floor empty.
And the dogs are back from their walk.
So that means it's probably time for us to wrap up.
Time to wrap. All right. Thank you for joining us. If you haven't already, please follow, share. It's the best way to support us. Rate us on your favorite podcast app. As always, thank you, Emmanuel, for joining me today. And time to go take care of the dogs.
Thanks, Laurel. Until next time.
Until next time.